Yesterday, Iraq's parliamentary leaders reached an agreement on 3 measures that could pave the way for what the New York Times calls the potential to spur reconciliation between Sunnis and Shiites. Will the spirit of compromise be permanent, or is this just a blip on the radar screen? The Real News spoke to Phyllis Bennis, senior analyst for the Institute for Policy Studies and currently a fellow at the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands.
The new law that was passed in the Iraqi parliament was a combined package, actually, of 3 major laws that have been unable to get unity in the parliament for the last year. This has been a terribly contentious debate, and in fact, just 24 hours before the vote, just 2 days ago, the parliament had split so badly, it was so rancorous, people were screaming at each other, that half the parliament got up and walked out, and the session was canceled. The expectation was, and a number of parliamentarians were calling for the parliament to be dissolved and for new elections. But instead, they were able to get back together, and what they did was to bind each of the 3 major groups to each other by packaging the 3 major laws, each of which had a supporter among a different faction of the parliament, into one grand vote. That was the way they were avoiding the problem of one faction voting for its own preference, its own preferred law, but ignoring the others. So the 3 laws were, one, the amnesty law that you mentioned, which primarily will benefit various Sunni parties. It's primarily aimed at Baathists and others who have been languishing in Iraqi jails. There's over 26,000 Iraqi prisoners being held in Iraqi jails, along with the 29,000 being held by the U.S. who are not covered by this amnesty. The amnesty is very narrow. It only affects those who have been in jail now for more than 6 months without being charged, or for more than a year after being charged without seeing a judge. It doesn't include those who are being charged with major crimes, murder, or anything like that, but it will involve a very large proportion of those 26,000 prisoners. The second part of the package was the budget law. A $48 billion budget was passed, and this was of particular interest to the Kurds because they have been fighting to keep the 17% allocation that they get in the budget, even though everybody else pretty much agrees that they represent only about 13 to 14% of the population. What's particularly complicated about this is that the budget allocation is aimed at what is known as Iraqi Kurdistan, the Kurdish region. But of course, there are Kurds throughout Iraq, particularly in Baghdad. So this notion of the allocation to, quote, the Kurds is a very difficult one because it, one, doesn't reflect the actual number of Kurds in the population, and it doesn't reach all the Kurds that live outside of the traditional Kurdish zone. The third part of it was the law that will determine the balance of power between the provincial legislatures and the national government. This was something that the Shia parties were particularly focused on, and the reason was they wanted a way of institutionalizing the fact that they are by far the largest sector of the population, and they wanted a way of institutionalizing their control, their domination in a major swath of particularly southern Iraq, just happens to be the largest oil richest, if you will, section of the country. And in that context, though, it showed up the divisions within the Shia community. The Shia community, like the rest of Iraq, is not unified across sectarian lines. And in this case, one of the largest and most influential Shia parties, the Supreme Islamic Council, right after the vote, came out against it, saying that the arrangement in the vote, in the law that had been passed, did not give enough power to the provinces and reserved too much power for the national government. It was the Shia party of Muqtada al-Sadr who had been the strongest, and because they have, while concerned about maintaining Shia domination, they also have a very nationalist view of how the elections should be run and how the government of Iraq should be run. So they were willing to compromise on a more nationalist approach with less power going to the provincial legislatures, and that's where there's now a big divide within the Shia community. The bottom line is, while this was voted on as a package and voted unanimously, none of the details have been made public, partly because it was done so much at the last minute that it had not even been published at the time the vote was taken. So a lot of these members of the parliament were voting on something they had not even seen, let alone have it be publicized and know whether it reflects what the population wants. So the notion that the passage of these laws technically is going to lead to a period of great peacefulness in Iraq is really a terrible illusion.